When 6-year-old Emma Smith told her father that the fancy lady next door cried herself to sleep every single night, Michael Smith thought his daughter was just being imaginative. But what he discovered about tech CEO Amanda Richardson would shatter everything he thought he knew about success, wealth, and the hidden battles that even the most powerful women fight behind closed doors. Before we dive into this incredible story that will change how you see your neighbors forever, drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from tonight. And if this story moves you the way it moved us, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're sharing something even more powerful about the connections that save us when we least expect it. The rain was coming down harder than it had all month in the quiet suburb of Willowbrook Heights, turning the manicured lawns into miniature lakes and making the evening commute a nightmare for anyone still brave enough to be on the roads. Michael Smith stood at his kitchen window, watching the water cascade down the glass while his 6-year-old daughter Emma worked on her homework at their small dining table behind him. Their modest 2-bedroom townhouse was warm and lived in, filled with Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator and the comfortable clutter that comes with a single father doing his best to create a home after losing everything that wants to find his family. Michael had been on his own with Emma for 14 months now, ever since the divorce papers were finalized and his ex-wife Rebecca had moved to Portland with her new boyfriend, a successful attorney who could provide the kind of stability that Michael's job as a middle school custodian simply couldn't match. The custody arrangement gave him Emma every other weekend and 2 weeks in summer, but Rebecca had surprised everyone by deciding she needed space to find herself and had left Emma with Michael permanently 6 months ago. Not that Michael was complaining. Emma was the light of his world, but the sudden shift from part-time to full-time single parenthood had been overwhelming in ways he was still learning to navigate. "Daddy," Emma's small voice cut through the sound of rain against the windows, "the crying lady is at it again." Michael turned from the window, his brow furrowed with the same confusion that crossed his face every time Emma mentioned their mysterious neighbor. "What crying lady, sweetheart?" "The pretty lady who lives in the big house," Emma said matter-of-factly, not looking up from her math worksheet where she was carefully writing the number 7 over and over again. "She sits by her window upstairs every night and cries. It makes me sad for her." The big house Emma referred to was the stunning contemporary home directly next to their townhouse complex, a glass and steel masterpiece that looked like something from an architecture magazine. It belonged to Amanda Richardson, the CEO of Next Tech Solutions, though Michael only knew this because the local newspaper had done a feature story about successful women entrepreneurs in their area last year. He'd seen her maybe 3 times in the 18 months they'd been neighbors, always getting into or out of her black Tesla, always perfectly dressed in business attire, always moving with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested she had somewhere important to be. Michael had never actually spoken to Amanda Richardson. Their worlds were separated by more than just the property line between a luxury home and subsidized housing. She lived in a realm of corporate boardrooms and international business deals, while he spent his days mopping floors and unclogging toilets at Jefferson Middle School. The closest they'd come to interaction was the occasional polite nod when their paths crossed at the mailbox, exchanges so brief and formal that Michael wasn't even sure she registered his existence as anything more than part of the neighborhood landscape. "Emma, I don't think Mrs. Richardson is crying," gently, moving to sit beside his daughter at the table. But Emma shook her head with the certainty that only 6-year-olds possessed about the things they observed. "No, Daddy, she sits in the chair by her window and she puts her head in her hands and her shoulders shake like when I cry about missing Mommy. I can see her from my bedroom window when I'm supposed to be sleeping." Michael felt a familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of Rebecca. Emma had been asking about her mother more frequently lately, wondering why Mommy had decided that her new life in Portland was more important than being close to her daughter. Michael had learned to deflect these conversations with gentle reassurance and promises that Mommy still loved her. But the truth was that Rebecca called maybe once a week, and her visits had dwindled to nothing over the past 3 months. "When do you see this, sweetheart?" Michael asked, trying to understand what Emma was actually observing. "Every night when I go to the bathroom," Emma explained. "Her light is always on and she's sitting there looking sad. Sometimes she talks on the phone and gets really upset. Last night she was pacing around and pulling her hair like you do when you're frustrated about bills." The specificity of Emma's observations gave Michael pause. His daughter had always been remarkably perceptive for her age, picking up on emotional undercurrents that adults often missed or ignored. When Rebecca had started pulling away from their marriage, Emma had been the first to sense something was wrong, asking why Mommy seemed angry all the time and why she didn't laugh at Daddy's jokes anymore. Michael glanced out the window toward Amanda Richardson's house, trying to see what Emma might be seeing from her upstairs bedroom. The contemporary home was designed with large windows that offered views of the interior spaces, part of the architectural aesthetic that prioritized natural light and open concepts. From certain angles, it would indeed be possible to see into the upstairs rooms, especially at night when the lights were on. "Maybe she's just working late," Michael suggested. "Important business people sometimes have to work at night." "She's not working," Emma said with the patient tone of a child explaining something obvious to an adult. "She's crying, Daddy, and she looks lonely, like how I feel when you're at your second job and Mrs. Patterson is babysitting me." The mention of loneliness hit Michael harder than he expected. Since the divorce, loneliness had become his constant companion, the uninvited guest at every meal, and the voice that whispered doubts during every quiet moment. He'd assumed that someone like Amanda Richardson, successful, wealthy, presumably surrounded by colleagues and friends, would be immune to the kind of isolation that plagued single parents living paycheck to paycheck. But as he looked across the rain-soaked yards toward the imposing glass house, Michael found himself wondering what Emma had actually witnessed. Was it possible that one of the most successful women in their city was struggling with the same kind of emotional pain that kept him awake some nights, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he was enough for Emma, if he could give her the life she deserved? The idea seemed almost absurd. Amanda Richardson had everything: a thriving company, financial security, a beautiful home, the respect of the business community. What could she possibly have to cry about? But Emma's words echoed in his mind as he helped her finish her homework and prepared their simple dinner of pasta and jarred sauce. "She looks lonely, like how I feel when you're at your second job and Mrs. Patterson is babysitting me." That night, after Emma had brushed her teeth and climbed into bed with her favorite stuffed elephant, Michael found himself standing in her bedroom doorway, looking out the window toward their neighbor's house. Sure enough, there was a light on in an upstairs window, and he could make out the silhouette of a figure sitting in what appeared to be a chair near the glass. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Michael realized that Emma hadn't been imagining things after all. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The alarm clock's piercing shriek cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 5:15 a.m., just as it had every weekday for the past 14 months since Michael Smith's world had been turned upside down. His weathered hand reached out from beneath the thin comforter that had seen better days, silencing the noise before it could wake Emma in the next room. The digital numbers glowed red in the darkness like angry eyes, reminding him that another day of juggling 2 jobs and single parenthood was about to begin. Michael sat on the edge of his narrow bed, running his hands through hair that seemed to be graying faster each month despite his 31 years. His back ached from yesterday's shift at Jefferson Middle School, where he'd spent 8 hours mopping floors, cleaning bathrooms, and fixing broken lockers. Tonight would bring his second job at the 24-hour diner downtown, where he washed dishes and cleaned tables until midnight, trying to scrape together enough money to cover the rent on their modest townhouse and Emma's childcare expenses. The walls of their small bedroom were thin enough that he could hear Emma's peaceful breathing through the drywall, a sound that never failed to remind him of what he was fighting for. Her bedroom was directly across the narrow hallway, painted in soft yellow because it was the cheapest paint the hardware store had on clearance when they moved in. Emma never complained about the color, just as she'd never complained about the secondhand furniture or the fact that her bed frame was actually 2 plastic storage containers with a mattress on top. Michael pulled on the same navy blue work uniform he wore every day, the shirt bearing a small tear near the left pocket that he kept meaning to mend but never found time for. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man who looked older than his years, with kind eyes that held the quiet exhaustion of someone carrying too much weight on his shoulders. The face staring back at him was still recognizable as the optimistic college graduate who'd married his high school sweetheart, but that man felt like a stranger now. The kitchen was barely large enough for two people to stand in comfortably, with outdated appliances that came with the rental and cabinets that didn't quite close properly. Michael moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency, preparing a simple breakfast of oatmeal and sliced bananas while brewing coffee in a machine that Rebecca had left behind, along with most of the other kitchen appliances she deemed too old for her new life. The stack of bills on the small counter seemed to mock him as he waited for the coffee to finish brewing. Electric bill, past due, rent notice, warning of late fees, Emma's daycare invoice highlighting the balance that kept growing each month, medical bills from Emma's emergency room visit when she'd had that fever last winter, amounts that insurance it deemed not covered for reasons Michael still didn't fully understand. He'd been doing the same math for months now, moving numbers around like puzzle pieces that never quite fit together. His salary from the school district covered about 60% of their monthly expenses. The diner job brought in enough to cover most of the rest, but there was never anything left over for emergencies, for savings, for the kind of security that would let him sleep soundly through the night. "Morning, Daddy," came Emma's sleepy voice from the kitchen doorway. She stood there in her favorite pajamas, the ones with cartoon cats that were getting too small, but that she refused to let him replace because they make me happy when I wake up. Her brown hair, so much like Rebecca's, stuck up in all directions, and she clutched her stuffed elephant against her chest like a shield against the day ahead. "Morning, sunshine," Michael said, opening his arms wide. Emma padded across the cold linoleum floor on bare feet and climbed onto his lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck in a hug that made every struggle worthwhile. For these few minutes each morning, before the day's responsibilities crashed down on them both, the world felt manageable again. "Did you see if the crying lady was okay last night?" Emma asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Michael's stomach tightened at the reminder of Amanda Richardson and the disturbing image Emma had painted of their successful neighbor in tears. He'd lain awake for 2 hours after putting Emma to bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince himself that his daughter's observations were just the product of an active imagination. But every time he'd started to drift off to sleep, he'd found himself thinking about the silhouette he'd glimpsed in the upstairs window, the hunched shoulders that did indeed suggest someone in distress. "I'm sure she's fine, sweetheart," Michael said, smoothing down Emma's tangled hair. "Sometimes grown-ups just have worries that keep them up late, like how I sometimes can't sleep when I'm thinking about work." "But she looked so sad," Emma insisted with the persistence that only 6-year-olds possessed when they knew they'd witnessed something important. "Maybe she needs a friend. You always tell me that friends help each other feel better." The innocent wisdom of his daughter's suggestion made Michael's chest ache. Emma had learned early that friendship was precious and rare, that the people who truly cared about you were worth treasuring. Her best friend was Mrs. Patterson, the 70-year-old widow who lived 2 doors down and watched Emma in the afternoons when Michael couldn't afford the extended daycare hours. Emma had also befriended Mr. Rodriguez, the maintenance supervisor at her school, who always saved the best crayons for her art projects and listened to her stories with genuine interest. But the idea of Michael Smith, a middle school custodian who could barely keep his own life together, reaching out to Amanda Richardson, a powerful CEO who probably earned more in a month than he made in a year, felt absurd. What could he possibly offer someone who lived in a world so far removed from his own? Their morning routine unfolded with the precision born of necessity. Michael prepared Emma's lunch in a brown paper bag decorated with her drawings, packing a peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, and a juice box that would have to sustain her until afternoon snack time. Emma got dressed in clothes that were clean, but showed the wear of being washed too many times in too hot water, and she brushed her teeth with the thoroughness of a child who understood that dentist visits were expensive and therefore to be avoided through good hygiene. At 6:45 a.m., they walked to the bus stop together, Emma's small hand tucked securely in Michael's larger one. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the leaves on the oak trees lining their street were just beginning to show hints of yellow and orange. Emma chattered about her plans for the day, about the book report she was working on and the new friends she'd made at recess, her voice bright with the optimism that childhood provided as a buffer against life's harsh realities. As they waited for the school bus, Michael found his gaze drawn inevitably toward Amanda Richardson's house. The contemporary structure looked imposing in the morning light, its clean lines and expensive materials a stark contrast to the modest townhouses that surrounded it. He could see her black Tesla and the circular driveway, perfectly positioned and gleaming as if it had been detailed that morning. Emma followed his gaze and squeezed his hand gently. "Maybe today you could wave at her," she suggested, with the kind of innocent hope that broke Michael's heart and inspired him in equal measure. "Maybe," Michael said softly, though he knew he wouldn't. He couldn't imagine a scenario where Amanda Richardson would welcome interaction with the struggling single father next door, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face the confirmation of how different their worlds really were. The school bus arrived with its familiar rumble and squeal of brakes, and Emma climbed aboard with a cheerful goodbye kiss and a promise to remember to eat all of her lunch. Michael watched through the window as she settled into her usual seat, waving at him until the bus turned the corner and disappeared from sight. Walking back to their townhouse alone, Michael felt the familiar weight of another day stretching ahead of him. 8 hours at the school, followed by a quick dinner with Emma, then 4 hours at the diner, then home to collapse into bed and start the cycle all over again. But as he passed Amanda Richardson's house, he found himself slowing his steps, looking up at the windows where Emma claimed to witness nightly scenes of despair. The house appeared perfect from the outside, a monument to success and achievement. But appearances, Michael had learned the hard way, could be deceiving. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe everyone, regardless of their circumstances, needed someone to care about whether they were okay. The question was whether he had the courage to find out. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower gleamed with polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city skyline. Amanda Richardson sat at the head of the conference table, her perfectly tailored charcoal suit and composed expression giving no hint of the exhaustion that had settled into her bones like a persistent ache. Around her, 12 of Nextech Solutions' most senior executives discussed quarterly projections and market expansion strategies, their voices blending into a familiar soundtrack of corporate ambition and calculated risk. At 34, Amanda had built Nextech from a small software startup into a multi-million-dollar enterprise specializing in artificial intelligence solutions for healthcare systems. The business magazines called her a visionary, a disruptor who had revolutionized how hospitals managed patient data and diagnostic protocols. Her success story was the kind that inspired conference keynotes and university commencement speeches, a testament to what determination and brilliant strategic thinking could accomplish in the modern economy. But as she listened to her chief financial officer present third-quarter earnings that exceeded all expectations, Amanda found her mind wandering to the empty rooms of her house in Willowbrook Heights, to the silence that would greet her when she finally arrived home near midnight, to the phone calls that never came, and the relationships that had withered under the relentless demands of building an empire. "Amanda, what are your thoughts on the European expansion timeline?" The voice of her vice president of operations, David Torres, cut through her mental fog. "I think we should accelerate the timeline by 6 months," Amanda replied without missing a beat, her years of executive experience allowing her to participate in the discussion even while part of her mind remained elsewhere. The meeting continued for another hour, covering everything from patent applications to employee retention strategies. Amanda participated with her usual sharp insights and decisive leadership, but beneath her professional demeanor, she felt the familiar hollowness that had become her constant companion for the past 2 years. When the last executive finally filed out of the boardroom, Amanda remained seated at the long table, staring out at the city lights that had begun to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Her assistant, Jennifer Walsh, appeared in the doorway with a tablet full of evening appointments and tomorrow's schedule. Your dinner with the venture capital group has been moved to 8:30. The restaurant confirmed your usual table, and I've briefed you on their portfolio companies. Also, your mother called again. She wanted to remind you about your father's birthday next week. Amanda's stomach clenched at the mention of her parents. Another obligation she'd been avoiding, another relationship strained by her inability to balance personal connections with professional demands. Her father would turn 68 next Thursday, and she hadn't spoken to him in 3 months. Not since their last conversation had devolved into his familiar lecture about her priorities and his concern that she was sacrificing her happiness for a company that would never love her back. "Canceled the dinner," Amanda said quietly. "Tell them I'm not feeling well. Reschedule for next week." Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly, but she made the note without comment. In the 5 years she'd worked for Amanda, she'd learned to recognize the signs when her boss was reaching her breaking point. The canceled social obligations, the longer hours in the office, the way Amanda's jaw tightened whenever anyone mentioned work-life balance. "Should I call your doctor?" Jennifer asked carefully. "You've been working 18-hour days for the past month." "I'm fine," Amanda replied automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Just tired. I'll work from home tomorrow morning and come in after lunch." The drive to Willowbrook Heights took 45 minutes in evening traffic, 45 minutes of hands-free phone calls with West Coast clients and voice memos about strategic initiatives that seemed increasingly meaningless the closer she got to her empty house. Amanda's Tesla navigated the familiar route while she half-listened to a conference call about quarterly budget allocations, her mind already anticipating the silence that awaited her. The contemporary house she'd purchased 18 months ago was a monument to her success and a daily reminder of her isolation. Every room had been professionally designed with clean lines and expensive materials. Every surface reflected the aesthetic vision of an interior decorator who understood style but had never asked about the client's actual needs or preferences. The result was a space that looked like a magazine spread but felt nothing like a home. Amanda parked in her circular driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the warm lights glowing in the windows of the modest townhouses next door. Through one window, she could see a man helping a small child with what appeared to be homework, their heads bent together over papers spread across a kitchen table. The scene looked so ordinary, so comfortable, that it made her chest ache with longing for something she'd never experienced. Inside her house, Amanda kicked off her designer heels and poured herself a glass of wine from a bottle that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. The kitchen was spotless because she rarely used it, equipped with professional-grade appliances that served no purpose beyond impressing visitors who never came. She ordered takeout from an upscale restaurant downtown, the same rotation of meals that had sustained her for months because making decisions about food felt like too much effort at the end of exhausting days. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, investors, and industry contacts, but none of them were personal. No friends asking about her day, no family members sharing funny stories or checking on her well-being. The people in her life related to her through the lens of business, seeing her as a resource to be leveraged or a contact to be cultivated, rather than a person who might need companionship or emotional support. At 11 o'clock, Amanda climbed the stairs to her bedroom, passing the home office where she'd spend another 2 hours reviewing contracts and responding to emails from the European markets that were just beginning their business day. The master bedroom was as impersonal as the rest of the house, decorated in neutral tones that were supposed to promote relaxation, but instead felt sterile and cold. She changed into silk pajamas and sat in the chair by the window that overlooked the townhouse complex next door, a ritual she'd developed without consciously choosing it. From this vantage point, she could observe the ordinary dramas of family life playing out in the modest homes below. Parents helping children with bedtime routines, couples sharing late-night conversations in their kitchens, teenagers doing homework while their families watched television together. Tonight, she could see the man from earlier sitting alone at his kitchen table, surrounded by what appeared to be bills and paperwork. His daughter was presumably asleep upstairs, and he looked tired in a way that Amanda recognized from her own mirror. The bone-deep exhaustion of someone carrying too much responsibility with too little support. Amanda opened her laptop and tried to focus on the quarterly reports that needed her review. But her attention kept drifting back to the window and the glimpse of a life so different from her own. The man next door was clearly struggling financially, if his modest surroundings were any indication, but there was something in the way he'd interacted with his daughter earlier that suggested a richness Amanda had never known, a sense of connection and purpose that had nothing to do with stock options or market valuations. Her phone rang, startling her from her observations. The caller ID showed her mother's number, and Amanda stared at it for a few rings before letting it go to voicemail. She wasn't ready for another conversation about her father's birthday, another gentle interrogation about her dating life, another reminder that success in business meant nothing if you ended up alone. As midnight approached, Amanda found herself crying, the tears coming without obvious trigger. They started as a few drops of frustration and exhaustion, but quickly became a torrent of grief for all the relationships she'd neglected, all the connections she'd sacrificed, all the ordinary moments of human warmth she'd traded for professional achievement. She cried for the friends who'd stopped calling when she canceled too many dinner plans, for the romantic relationships that had withered under the pressure of her impossible schedule, for the family gatherings she'd missed and the conversations she'd postponed until tomorrow became never. Most of all, she cried for the version of herself she'd lost somewhere along the way, the woman who'd once believed that success would feel different than this, that achievement would fill the empty spaces in her life rather than expand them. From her window, Amanda could see that the light was still on in the kitchen next door, where the single father continued working through his own pile of problems. She wondered what kept him awake, what struggles consumed his late-night hours, whether he ever felt the crushing weight of responsibilities that seemed to multiply faster than solutions.
The irony wasn't lost on her that she had everything she'd thought she wanted and was miserable, while her neighbor appeared to have very little but seemed to possess something precious that all her money couldn't buy. She had power, influence, and financial security beyond most people's dreams, but she sat alone in her expensive house night after night, crying into the darkness while strangers lived their connected lives just a few yards away. Amanda closed her laptop and wiped her eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of meetings and decisions, another performance of competence and control that hid the growing certainty that she was disappearing piece by piece into a success story that felt increasingly hollow. What she didn't know was that her nightly ritual of grief had been witnessed, that a 6-year-old girl in the townhouse next door had been watching her tears with the kind of innocent concern that could change everything, if only the right person was listening. The opportunity came on a Saturday morning in early October, when Emma's soccer ball sailed over the low fence that separated their townhouse complex from Amanda Richardson's immaculate yard. Michael watched from their small patio as the bright pink ball rolled across the perfectly manicured lawn, coming to rest near the contemporary house's glass front door like a colorful interruption in an otherwise pristine landscape. "I'll get it, Daddy," Emma called out, already heading toward the fence with the fearless enthusiasm that only 6-year-olds possessed when faced with minor obstacles. "Wait, sweetheart," Michael said quickly, catching up to her before she could climb over the decorative barrier. "That's Mrs. Richardson's yard. We should ask permission first." Emma looked puzzled by this concept, her small face scrunched in concentration. "But it's just a ball, and she seems nice. Maybe she wants to play with us." The innocence of his daughter's assumption made Michael's chest tighten with a mixture of love and protective anxiety. Emma saw the world through the lens of childhood optimism, where neighbors were potential friends and social boundaries were simply obstacles to be overcome with politeness and good intentions. She had no understanding of the invisible barriers that separated their modest circumstances from Amanda Richardson's world of corporate success and luxury living. Michael glanced toward the house, half hoping to see some sign that Amanda wasn't home, that they could retrieve the ball quickly and retreat to their own space without having to navigate the awkward social dynamics of their vastly different lives. but the black Tesla was parked in the circular driveway and he could see lights on in several rooms, suggesting that their wealthy neighbor was indeed present. "Come on, Emma," Michael said, taking his daughter's hand and walking around to the front of Amanda's property. "We'll ring the doorbell and ask politely." The contemporary house looked even more imposing up close, its clean lines and expensive materials creating an aesthetic that belonged in architectural magazines rather than suburban neighborhoods. The front door was made of dark wood and frosted glass, with modern hardware that probably cost more than Michael made in a week. As they approached, Michael felt acutely aware of his weekend clothes, faded jeans with a small hole in one knee, a worn flannel shirt that had seen better days, work boots that were practical but far from fashionable. Emma, however, showed no such self-consciousness. She reached up to press the doorbell with the confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt her welcome in any space. The melodic chime that echoed from inside the house sounded sophisticated and expensive, nothing like the harsh buzzer that served the same function in their townhouse. Michael heard footsteps approaching from inside, and his heart rate quickened with the kind of nervous energy he hadn't experienced since job interviews. What was he supposed to say to Amanda Richardson? How did one apologize for disturbing someone whose time was presumably worth hundreds of dollars per hour? The door opened to reveal Amanda herself, looking surprisingly casual in dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Without her business attire and corporate armor, she appeared younger and more approachable, though I could still see the careful composure that never seemed to leave her completely. "I'm sorry to bother you," Michael began immediately, his words tumbling out in a rush of embarrassment. "Our ball went over the fence, and I know you're probably busy, so if you could just point us toward it, we'll grab it and get out of your way." Amanda's eyes moved from Michael to Emma, who was looking up at her with the kind of open curiosity that adults often found both charming and unsettling. For a moment, something flickered across Amanda's carefully controlled expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of some kind. "You're the little girl from next door," Amanda said, her voice softer than Michael had expected. "I've seen you playing in your yard." Emma beamed at this acknowledgement, apparently taking it as confirmation that Amanda had been watching them with friendly interest, rather than the mild annoyance that Michael had assumed their presence might generate. "I'm Emma, and this is my daddy, Michael," Emma announced with the formal politeness she'd been taught from meeting new people. "We live in the townhouses, and sometimes I wave at you when you're in your car, but I don't think you see me." Michael felt heat rise in his cheeks at this revelation. He'd been unaware that Emma had been attempting to interact with their neighbor, and the idea that Amanda might have noticed and ignored his daughter's friendly gestures made him want to retreat immediately to the safety of their own modest space. I do see you," Amanda said quietly, crouching down to Emma's eye level in a gesture that surprised Michael with its genuine warmth. I wave back, but I guess you can't see me through the car windows. Emma's face lit up with delight at this information, as if she'd just learned that her attempts at friendship hadn't been rejected, but simply lost in translation. I knew you were nice. I told Daddy you were nice, but he said we shouldn't bother you because you're important and busy. Michael wanted to disappear into the ground. His attempt to teach Emma about respecting boundaries and social hierarchies had apparently backfired, making him sound like someone who judged people based on their wealth and status rather than their character, which, he realized with uncomfortable clarity, might not have been entirely inaccurate. Everyone deserves to be bothered a little bit, Amanda said, still speaking directly to Emma with a sincerity that caught Michael off guard, especially by neighbors who were just being friendly. She stood and looked at Michael, and he found himself studying her face more closely than he ever had before. Without her corporate persona fully in place, he could see traces of the exhaustion that Emma had been witnessing from her bedroom window, the subtle signs of someone carrying emotional weight that success and money couldn't alleviate. The ball is over by the front steps, Amanda said, gesturing toward where the pink sphere had come to rest. Feel free to grab it. And please don't feel like you need to apologize for normal neighbor things like balls going over fences. It happens. Emma scampered off to retrieve her ball, while Michael stood awkwardly on the doorstep,
unsure if this interaction was concluded or if some additional social ritual was expected. Amanda seemed to be studying him with the same curiosity he was trying not to display too obviously, as if she too was attempting to reconcile her assumptions about their different lives with the reality of face-to-face conversation. "I hope our noise doesn't disturb you," Michael said, falling back on politeness to fill the uncomfortable silence. "Emma likes to play outside, and sometimes she gets pretty enthusiastic." "I like hearing her play," Amanda replied, and something in her tone suggested this wasn't just polite conversation, but a genuine admission. "It's nice hearing family sounds, life sounds." The phrase life sounds struck Michael as both oddly poetic and deeply sad, as if Amanda lived in a world where the ordinary rhythms of daily existence were something to be observed rather than experienced. He found himself wondering what kind of sounds filled her beautiful, empty house, whether she ever felt the crushing weight of silence that he remembered from the months immediately after his divorce. Emma returned with her ball, but instead of heading back toward their own yard, she lingered near Amanda's feet with the persistence of a child who sensed an opportunity for extended social interaction. "Do you want to see how high I can kick it?" Emma asked hopefully. "I've been practicing, and Daddy says I'm getting really good." Michael opened his mouth to redirect Emma away from what he assumed would be an unwelcome request, but Amanda spoke first. "I'd love to see," she said, and the eagerness in her voice seemed genuine rather than merely polite. Emma proceeded to demonstrate her soccer skills on Amanda's perfect lawn, chattering about her team and her friends and her teacher while she dribbled the ball between invisible obstacles. Amanda watched with the kind of focused attention that suggested she wasn't just being polite, but was actually interested in Emma's 6-year-old commentary on life. "She's wonderful," Amanda said quietly to Michael as they stood watching Emma's impromptu performance. "You've done a beautiful job raising her." The compliment hit Michael harder than he had expected, partly because it came from someone whose success suggested high standards, but mostly because single parenting felt like a constant exercise in uncertainty and self-doubt. Most days he wondered if he was providing Emma with enough stability, enough opportunities, enough of everything she needed to thrive. "I'm just trying to not mess it up too badly," Michael replied honestly, then immediately regretted the admission. It seemed inappropriate to share his parental insecurities with someone he barely knew, especially someone whose life appeared to be a masterclass in having everything under control. But Amanda's expression softened with what looked like understanding rather than judgment. "I think the fact that you worry about it means you're probably doing better than you think." There was something in her voice, a quality of longing or recognition, that made Michael look at her more carefully. For just a moment, her composed exterior slipped, and he caught a glimpse of someone who might understand more about struggle and uncertainty than her perfect house and successful career would suggest. Emma chose that moment to announce that she was tired of playing soccer and wanted to show Amanda her favorite rock, which she had apparently been carrying in her pocket throughout this entire interaction. She produced a small, smooth stone that was completely unremarkable except for the enthusiasm with which she presented it. "It's very pretty," Amanda said solemnly, examining the rock as if it were a precious gem. "Where did you find it?" "In our yard, near the fence," Emma explained. "I think it might be magic because it makes me feel happy when I hold it." Michael braced himself for the kind of patronizing adult response that usually greeted Emma's flights of imagination, but Amanda nodded as if the concept of magic rocks was perfectly reasonable. "I think you might be right about the magic," Amanda said seriously. "Some things have special power, even if we can't explain why." Emma beamed at this validation of her theory, and, apparently emboldened by Amanda's receptiveness to her ideas, launched into a detailed explanation of her collection of potentially magical objects, which included several more rocks, a bird feather, and a button that had fallen off one of Michael's work shirts. Michael found himself relaxing despite his initial discomfort, drawn into the easy flow of conversation between Amanda and his daughter.
There was something unexpectedly natural about the interaction, as if the social boundaries he'd been worried about were less relevant than he'd assumed. Amanda seemed genuinely interested in Emma's stories, asking follow-up questions and responding with the kind of engaged attention that children craved from adults. But as the conversation continued, Michael became increasingly aware of the fundamental differences in their circumstances. Amanda's casual weekend clothes probably cost more than his monthly rent. Her house represented a level of financial security that he couldn't imagine achieving in his lifetime. Even her relaxed demeanor spoke of someone who had choices and resources that were foreign to his experience of constant financial pressure and limited options. When Emma finally announced that she was ready to go back home, Michael felt a mixture of relief and unexpected disappointment. The interaction had been more pleasant than he'd anticipated, but it also highlighted the gap between their worlds in ways that made him uncomfortable. Amanda Richardson was kind to his daughter and polite to him, but that didn't change the fact that they lived completely different lives with completely different problems. "Thank you for being so patient with Emma, and sorry again about the ball." "Please don't apologize," Amanda replied, and there was something almost urgent in her voice. "It was really nice to meet you both properly. I hope we'll see each other again." As they walked back toward their townhouse, Emma skipping ahead with her recovered soccer ball, Michael found himself puzzling over Amanda's final words. There had been something wistful in her tone, almost lonely, that didn't match his assumptions about her life of success and fulfillment. But perhaps, he thought, everyone carried struggles that weren't visible from the outside. Perhaps even successful CEOs had reasons to sit by their windows at night, looking out at other people's lives and wondering what they were missing. The question was whether two people from such different worlds could find any common ground beyond polite neighborly interactions and shared concern for a 6-year-old's enthusiasm for magic rocks. The turning point came 3 weeks later, on Thursday evening when Michael arrived home from his shift at Jefferson Middle School to find Mrs. Patterson waiting on his doorstep with Emma and an expression of barely contained worry etched across her weathered face. The 70-year-old widow who had become their unofficial family member over the past year rarely showed signs of distress, so the sight of her wringing her hands and pacing made Michael's stomach drop with immediate concern. "What's wrong?" Michael asked, dropping his work bag and immediately scanning Emma for signs of injury or illness. His daughter appeared physically fine, sitting on the front steps and drawing in her notebook with the focused concentration she applied to all her artistic endeavors. But something in her posture suggested she was listening intently to the adult conversation happening around her. "It's not Emma," Mrs. Patterson said quickly, understanding her parental panic. "She's been perfect, as always. But, Michael, something happened today that I think you need to know about, and I've been wrestling with whether it's my place to tell you." Emma looked up from her drawing, her small face serious with the kind of expression children wore when they were processing adult situations that felt important but confusing. "Mrs. Patterson is worried about the crying lady. She saw her today, too."
Michael felt his heart rate increase as the implications of Emma's words sank in. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years and prided herself on minding her own business while still caring about her neighbors, had apparently witnessed whatever Emma had been observing from her bedroom window for weeks. "What did you see?" Michael asked gently, crouching down to Mrs. Patterson's eye level as she settled onto the front steps beside Emma. "I was watering my plants on the back patio this afternoon when I heard crying," Mrs. Patterson began, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone choosing their words with deliberation. "Real sobbing, Michael, the kind that comes from deep pain. I thought maybe someone was hurt, so I went to investigate." She paused, glancing at Emma before continuing. "Your neighbor, that successful woman with the fancy house, was sitting in her backyard, just sitting there in one of those expensive patio chairs, crying like her heart was breaking. She didn't see me watching, and I probably should have looked away, but, Michael, I've never seen someone look so alone. Michael absorbed this information with a mixture of concern and confusion. Amanda Richardson, the composed CEO who commanded boardrooms and built business empires, sobbing in her backyard in the middle of the afternoon, suggested a level of distress that went far beyond whatever Emma had been witnessing during nighttime hours. Did she seem hurt? Like, physically injured? Michael asked, his mind immediately jumping to practical concerns. No, nothing like that, Mrs. Patterson replied. This was emotional pain, the kind I recognized from my own dark days after Harold passed away. The kind that makes you feel like you're drowning in your own life. Emma had stopped drawing and was listening with the intense focus she brought to conversations that felt significant beyond her understanding. I told you she was sad, she said quietly. I told you she needed a friend. The simple wisdom of his 6-year-old daughter's assessment hit Michael with uncomfortable clarity. Emma had been trying to tell him for weeks that their neighbor was suffering, and he'd dismissed her observations as childhood imagination rather than the perceptive awareness that children often possessed about adult emotions. There's more, Mrs. Patterson continued, her expression growing even more troubled. After she stopped crying, she got on the phone with someone. I couldn't help but overhear some of it, and, Michael, she was talking to her mother about canceling some family event, making excuses about work being too demanding. Her voice was so flat, so empty. It reminded me of how I sounded during those first months after Harold passed away, when I was going through the motions but not really living. Michael found himself thinking about his brief interaction with Amanda 3 weeks earlier, how she'd seemed genuinely interested in Emma's stories and had spoken about life sounds with such wistful longing. He'd sensed something beneath her polished exterior during that conversation, but he'd attributed it to normal adult stress rather than the kind of profound isolation Mrs. Patterson was describing. What do you think I should do? Michael asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Getting involved in Amanda Richardson's personal struggles felt like crossing boundaries that existed for good reasons, like venturing into territory where his working-class background and limited resources would be inadequate to provide meaningful help. I think, Mrs. Patterson said slowly, that sometimes God puts people in our path not because we have everything they need, but because we have exactly what they need in that moment. And sometimes what people need most is simply for someone to notice that they're drowning. Emma had resumed drawing, but Michael could see that she was creating a picture of 3 stick figures standing together under a rainbow. When he looked more closely, he realized the figures were labeled in her careful 6-year-old handwriting. Daddy, Emma, and Amanda. She draws pictures of all 3 of us now, Emma said, noticing his attention. Because I think she wants to be part of our family, but she doesn't know how to ask. The innocence of Emma's interpretation cut through all of Michael's adult complications about social boundaries and class differences. Her daughter saw the situation with the clarity that came from not yet learning that the world was divided into categories of people who belonged together and people who didn't. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed and Michael had completed his usual routine of reviewing bills and preparing for the next day's responsibilities, he found himself standing at Emma's bedroom window, looking across the yards towards Amanda's house. Sure enough, there was a light on in her upstairs room, and he could see her silhouette in the chair where Emma claimed to witness her nightly tears. He stood there for nearly an hour, wrestling with a decision that felt far more significant than his limited interaction with Amanda would seem to warrant. Part of him argued that her problems were beyond his ability to solve, that his own life was complicated enough without taking on the emotional burdens of someone who lived in a completely different world. What could a middle school custodian possibly offer to a successful CEO that she couldn't purchase or achieve through her own resources? But another part of him, the part that had been shaped by Emma's wisdom and Mrs. Patterson's compassion, recognized that human pain was universal regardless of bank account balances or professional achievements. Amanda Richardson might have everything money could buy, but she clearly lacked something that Michael understood intimately: the sustaining power of genuine human connection. The next morning, Michael made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of heading directly to work after dropping Emma at school, he stopped at the small flower shop downtown and purchased a simple bouquet of mixed wildflowers. Nothing expensive or elaborate, just something that conveyed thoughtfulness without crossing inappropriate boundaries. He drove to Amanda's house and sat in his car for 10 minutes, second-guessing the impulse that had brought him there. What was he supposed to say? How did one offer comfort to someone whose life appeared perfect from the outside? What if she was offended by his presumption that she needed help? But as he sat there debating, Michael remembered Mrs. Patterson's words about people being placed in each other's paths for reasons that might not be immediately clear. He thought about Emma's unwavering belief that their neighbor needed friendship, and about his own experience of how isolating grief and struggle could be when faced alone. Michael walked to Amanda's front door and rang the bell, holding the wildflower bouquet and hoping his instincts were right about what she might need. When the door opened, Amanda appeared wearing business attire and looking like she was preparing to leave for work. But her eyes were red-rimmed in a way that confirmed everything Mrs. Patterson had observed. "Michael," Amanda said, her voice carrying surprise and something that might have been relief. "Is everything okay? Is Emma all right?" "Emma's fine," Michael replied quickly, then found himself at a loss for how to explain his presence. The rehearsed words he'd practiced in the cars suddenly seemed inadequate for the complexity of the situation. "I brought you these," he said, finally, offering the flowers with an awkwardness that made him feel like a teenager attempting his first romantic gesture. I wanted you to know that someone notices if you're having a hard time." Amanda stared at the bouquet for a long moment, her carefully composed expression shifting through several emotions before settling on something that looked dangerously close to tears. When she reached out to accept the flowers, her hands were trembling slightly. "How did you know?" she asked quietly, her professional demeanor cracking to reveal the vulnerability that she'd been working so hard to hide. "Emma's been worried about you," Michael said honestly. "She sees you sometimes in the evenings, and she has this theory that everyone needs friends when they're sad. I thought maybe she was right." Amanda looked at the wildflowers in her hands as if they were the most precious gift she'd ever received. "I can't remember the last time someone gave me flowers just to be kind. Everything in my life is transactional, professional, calculated. This is just nice." "Would you like to have coffee sometime?" Michael asked, the words tumbling out before he could reconsider their implications. "I mean, as neighbors, as friends. Emma would probably love to show you her rock collection properly, and I make decent coffee, even if everything else about my life is pretty basic." The offer hung between them, representing a choice that would fundamentally change the carefully maintained boundaries of their separate worlds. Michael could see Amanda processing the invitation, weighing whatever concerns successful CEOs had about forming friendships with working-class single fathers. "I would really like that," Amanda said finally, her voice carrying a sincerity that cut through all the social complications Michael had been worrying about. "More than you probably realize." As Michael drove to work that morning, he reflected on how sometimes the most important decisions were the ones that felt simultaneously terrifying and inevitable. He'd just invited a woman who could probably buy his entire apartment complex to have coffee in his modest kitchen, and somehow that felt like the beginning of something important rather than a recipe for embarrassment. Emma had been right all along. Sometimes people just needed someone to notice when they were drowning, and sometimes the person who noticed was exactly the right person to throw them a lifeline, regardless of what their different lives might look like from the outside. The question now was whether two people from such different circumstances could build a genuine friendship. and whether that friendship might offer both of them something they've been missing without realizing it. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible, and Michael found himself cleaning his modest kitchen with an attention to detail that would have impressed his most demanding supervisor at Jefferson Middle School. He had rearranged the mismatched chairs around their small dining table 3 times, hidden the stack of unpaid bills in a drawer, and even managed to find a glass jar that could serve as a makeshift vase for Emma's wildflowers that had somehow transformed their simple kitchen into something that felt almost welcoming. Emma had been awake since dawn, her excitement about Amanda's visit manifesting in a whirlwind of preparation that included laying out her entire collection of special rocks on the coffee table, practicing her best handwriting on a welcome sign, and changing clothes 4 times before settling on her favorite dress with the purple butterflies. She approached the morning with the same enthusiasm she brought to Christmas morning, as if she understood that something significant was about to happen in their small world. "Daddy, do you think Amanda likes pancakes?" Emma asked for the 3rd time, bouncing on her toes while Michael measured coffee grounds with the precision of someone who rarely had guests worth impressing. "Because I could help you make them, and mine are almost as good as yours now." "I think she'll like whatever we make," Michael replied, though privately he wondered if Amanda Richardson was accustomed to weekend brunches that involved catered spreads and fresh squeezed orange juice, rather than instant pancake mix and coffee from a can. The thought made his stomach flutter with nerves, but he pushed the anxiety aside, reminding himself that Amanda had seemed genuinely grateful for simple kindness when he'd brought her the flowers. When the doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock, Emma raced to answer it with Michael close behind, both of them arriving at the door slightly out of breath and wearing matching expressions of anticipation. Amanda stood on their small front porch, holding a paper bag from the expensive bakery downtown, looking somehow both perfectly put together and endearingly uncertain. She'd dressed casually in dark jeans and a soft gray sweater, but even her weekend attire carried the kind of understated elegance that suggested careful curation rather than the practical necessity that governed Michael's wardrobe choices. Still, there was something different about her demeanor compared to their previous interactions, a relaxed quality that made her seem more approachable despite the obvious differences in their circumstances. "I brought pastries," Amanda said, holding up the bakery bag with a smile that transformed her entire face. "I wasn't sure what you liked, so I got a variety. And Emma, I have something special for you." From her purse, Amanda produced a small, wrapped package that sent Emma into raptures of curiosity and delight. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound notebook with Emma's name embossed on the cover in gold lettering, along with a set of colored pencils that were clearly professional quality, rather than the basic supplies they usually bought from the discount store. "For your drawings and your special rock collection notes," Amanda explained as Emma ran her fingers reverently over the smooth leather cover. "I thought someone who appreciates magic deserves proper equipment for documenting it." The thoughtfulness of the gift caught Michael off guard, not because of its obvious expense, but because of the attention Amanda had paid to Emma's interests during their brief previous interaction. She'd remembered Emma's fascination with potentially magical objects, and had chosen something that acknowledged the seriousness with which his daughter approached her collections and observations. "This is the most beautiful notebook I've ever seen," Emma breathed, clutching it against her chest. "Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to draw you a special picture in it right now." As Emma settled at the coffee table with her new art supplies, Michael and Amanda found themselves in the kitchen, working together to arrange the bakery pastries on his mismatched plates while the coffee finished brewing. The domestic routine felt surprisingly natural despite their different backgrounds, and Michael found himself relaxing as they fell into easy conversation about mundane topics like the weather and the neighborhood's ongoing construction project. "Your house is lovely," Amanda said, accepting a cup of coffee and looking around the small kitchen with genuine appreciation rather than the polite assessment Michael had been dreading. "It feels like a real home, warm and lived in." "It's small," Michael said automatically, then caught himself falling into the defensive pattern he'd developed when people of obvious means entered his space. "But it works for us." Emma's happy here, and that's what matters most. Emma seems happy everywhere, Amanda observed, watching through the doorway as Emma carefully sketched in her new notebook with complete focus. She has this wonderful quality of finding joy in simple things. I envy that ability. There was something wistful in Amanda's voice that made Michael look at her more closely. Without her corporate armor and surrounded by the comfortable clutter of family life, she seemed younger and more vulnerable, like someone who had been carrying adult responsibilities for so long that she'd forgotten how to simply enjoy a Saturday morning. She gets that from her mother, Michael said, and immediately regretted the reference to Rebecca, who had been notably absent from Emma's life for months. But Amanda's expression showed interest rather than discomfort, so he continued. Rebecca always found reasons to celebrate ordinary moments. Birthday breakfasts for no reason, dance parties in the living room, elaborate treasure hunts that led to finding her own toys hidden around the house. "That sounds wonderful," Amanda said softly. "Where is Emma's mother now?" The question was asked with such gentle curiosity that Michael found himself answering more honestly than he intended. Portland. She decided she needed to find herself, which apparently required leaving Emma behind to figure out what that meant. Amanda's expression shifted to something that looked like recognition rather than pity. "Sometimes people run from the things that matter most because they're scared of not being good enough for them," she said quietly. "It doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable." There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience with running from important things, and Michael found himself wondering what Amanda Richardson might have been avoiding in her pursuit of professional success. But before he could explore the thought further, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway with her notebook, open to display her latest creation. "Look!" she announced proudly. "I drew Amanda having coffee with us, and I made sure to include the happiness lines around everyone's faces." The drawing was unmistakably Emma's work, complete with stick figures and disproportionate features, but it captured something true about the morning that Michael hadn't fully realized until seeing it rendered in colored pencil. All three figures were indeed smiling, and Emma had surrounded them with rays of sunshine and what she apparently considered happiness lines. "It's perfect," Amanda said, studying the drawing with the seriousness it deserved. "May I take a picture of it? I'd love to have a copy." Emma beamed at this request and posed proudly beside her artwork while Amanda took several photos with her phone. The simple exchange felt significant in a way that Michael couldn't quite articulate, as if Emma's innocent artistry had captured something important about the connections forming between them. The rest of the morning unfolded with an ease that surprised all of them. Amanda proved to be genuinely interested in Emma's rock collection, listening with focused attention as Emma explained the specific magical properties she'd attributed to each specimen. She asked thoughtful questions about Emma's school projects and her favorite books, engaging with the kind of patient interest that children rarely received from busy adults. When Emma suggested they look for new, potentially magical objects in their small backyard, Amanda agreed with enthusiasm that seemed entirely genuine. Michael watched from the kitchen window as his daughter led their successful neighbor on a thorough exploration of their modest yard, pointing out interesting leaves and unusual stones with the confidence of someone sharing treasured secrets. "She really likes you," Michael said, when Amanda returned to the kitchen with dirt under her fingernails and a smile that made her look like a different person entirely from the composed CEO he'd first observed from a distance. "I really like her too," Amanda replied, washing her hands at the sink with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had forgotten to worry about maintaining professional appearances. "She sees magic in everything. When did I stop seeing magic in anything?" The question seemed to be directed more to herself than to Michael, but he found himself answering anyway. "Maybe you didn't stop seeing it. Maybe you just got too busy to look for it." Amanda turned from the sink to study his face, and Michael felt suddenly exposed under her direct gaze. There was an intelligence in her eyes that suggested she was processing more than just his words, evaluating him in ways that made him simultaneously nervous and intrigued. "What made you decide to reach out to me?" Most people would have assumed that someone with my life has everything figured out. Michael considered several diplomatic answers before settling on honesty. Emma kept telling me you were sad, and Mrs. Patterson saw you crying in your backyard. I guess I realized that success doesn't protect people from loneliness any more than struggling protects them from caring about others. Amanda's eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide, and Michael felt a moment of panic that he'd overstepped some invisible boundary. But when she spoke, her voice carried gratitude rather than offense. No one has cared enough to notice that I was struggling in longer than I can remember. Everyone in my life relates to me through business, through what I can do for them professionally. You brought me flowers because your 6-year-old daughter was worried about me. That's the kindest thing anyone has done for me in years. The admission hung between them, revealing the profound isolation that Amanda had been carrying beneath her successful exterior. Michael found himself understanding something important about the price of achievement, about how the higher someone climbed professionally, the more isolated they could become from the basic human connections that made life meaningful. Emma chose that moment to return to the kitchen, announcing that she'd found 3 new potentially magical objects and wanted to document them in her special notebook. As she settled at the table with her treasures, chattering about their possible powers, Michael and Amanda exchanged a look of shared understanding over her head. The morning had transformed something fundamental in their relationship, moving them from cautious neighbors to genuine friends. But more than that, it had given both adults something they hadn't realized they were missing. Amanda had experienced the warmth of family connection and unconditional acceptance, while Michael had discovered that reaching across social boundaries could lead to meaningful relationships that enriched rather than complicated his life.
As Amanda prepared to leave, Emma made her promise to come back the following Saturday, extracting a commitment that Amanda gave with obvious pleasure. Michael walked her to the door, both of them moving slowly, as if reluctant to end the morning that had surprised them both with its natural warmth. "Thank you," Amanda said simply, but the words carried weight that encompassed more than just gratitude for coffee and pastries. "This morning gave me something I didn't know I was desperately missing." "Same here," Michael replied, realizing as he said it that it was completely true. Having Amanda in their home had reminded him that his life had room for adult friendship and intellectual connection, that single parenthood didn't have to mean social isolation. As he watched Amanda drive away in her expensive car, Michael felt the beginning of something that might have been hope, not just for his growing friendship with Amanda, but for the possibility that Emma's simple belief in the power of kindness to connect different worlds might be more than just childhood optimism. Sometimes, he thought, the most profound changes began with the smallest gestures of human compassion, and sometimes those gestures led to friendships that neither person had known they needed until they found themselves sitting in a modest kitchen, sharing coffee, and discovering that connection transcended all the surface differences that seemed so important until they simply didn't matter anymore. 2 months into their Saturday morning tradition, Michael received the phone call that would test everything they'd built together. He was at Jefferson Middle School, finishing his evening shift and looking forward to picking up Emma from Mrs. Patterson's house, when his phone buzzed with an unknown number that he almost ignored. Something about the late hour and the persistent ringing made him answer, and Jennifer Walsh's professional but strained voice cut through the ambient noise of the empty school hallway. "Mr. Smith, this is Jennifer, Amanda Richardson's assistant. I apologize for calling so late, but Amanda specifically asked me to contact you if anything ever happened to her." Jennifer paused, and Michael could hear the weight of bad news in her silence. "Amanda collapsed during a board meeting this afternoon. She's been admitted to Riverside General Hospital, and she's asking for you and Emma." The words hit Michael like a physical blow, transforming his peaceful evening routine into a crisis that he felt completely unprepared to handle. Amanda had become such a steady presence in their lives over the past weeks that the idea of her being seriously ill felt like a fundamental disruption of the world's natural order. She'd spent last Saturday teaching Emma how to make proper tea, laughing at her daughter's elaborate ceremony around sugar cubes and tiny spoons, looking healthier and more content than Michael had ever seen her. "What happened? Is she going to be okay?"
Michael asked, already gathering his cleaning supplies with the distracted efficiency of someone whose mind was entirely focused elsewhere. The doctors are still running tests, but they think it might be exhaustion and severe stress. She's been working 100-hour weeks for the past month, trying to close a major acquisition deal. I've been telling her to slow down, but you know how she is about work. Michael didn't actually know how Amanda was about work because during their Saturday mornings, she had seemed like someone who had found balance and perspective, someone who prioritized relationship and simple pleasures over professional achievement. The disconnect between the Amanda he'd come to know and the workaholic Jennifer was describing made him realize how much his friend had been struggling to maintain two completely different versions of herself. 20 minutes later, Michael and Emma sat in the sterile waiting area of Riverside General's cardiac unit, surrounded by the kind of uncomfortable chairs and fluorescent lighting that made every emotion feel more intense and every minute stretch like an hour. Emma clutched her leather notebook against her chest, having insisted on bringing it so she could show Amanda the drawing she'd made during the week, unaware that their friend might not be well enough to appreciate 6-year-old artwork. "Is Amanda going to be like Grandpa Harold before he went to heaven?" Emma asked with the directness that children brought to questions adults preferred to avoid. Michael's throat tightened at the reference to Mrs. Patterson's late husband, whose final weeks Emma had witnessed with the uncomfortable proximity that came from living in a small community where everyone knew each other's business. Harold Patterson had spent his last month in a hospital bed much like the one Amanda presumably occupied somewhere in this maze of medical efficiency and controlled crisis. "Amanda is going to be fine," Michael said, hoping it was true. "Sometimes grown-ups just work too hard and their bodies tell them they need to rest." When they were finally allowed into Amanda's room, Michael felt his heart break at the sight of her looking so small and vulnerable beneath the hospital's standard-issue blankets. She was awake but appeared exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness, as if the relentless pace of her professional life had finally extracted a price that even her considerable determination couldn't pay. "You came," Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying unmistakable relief. "I wasn't sure if Jennifer would be able to reach you." Emma approached the hospital bed with the careful reverence she had learned during visits to elderly neighbors, understanding instinctively that loud voices and sudden movements weren't appropriate when people were sick. She placed her notebook on the bedside table and gently patted Amanda's hand with the kind of tenderness that suggested she had appointed herself as their friend's primary caregiver. "I brought my drawings to show you," Emma said quietly, "but you don't have to look at them right now if you're too tired. They'll wait until you feel better."
Amanda's eyes filled with tears at Emma's consideration, and Michael realized that his daughter's innocent compassion was probably more healing than any medical intervention the hospital could provide. There was something powerful about being cared for without conditions or expectations, about having someone's presence offered as a gift rather than an obligation. "The doctor says I had what they call a stress-induced cardiac episode," Amanda explained to Michael, while Emma carefully arranged get-well cards for Mrs. Patterson and some of the neighbors who'd heard about the hospitalization. "My blood pressure spiked so high during the board meeting that I passed out. They're keeping me for observation, but mostly they're telling me that I need to make some serious changes in how I live." Michael pulled the visitor chair closer to Amanda's bed, settling in for what he sensed would be an important conversation. Over the past 2 months, he'd learned to read the subtle expressions that crossed Amanda's face when she was processing difficult emotions. And right now, she looked like someone confronting truths she'd been avoiding for years. "What kind of changes?" he asked gently. "The kind that feel impossible when you've built your entire identity around working yourself to death," Amanda replied with bitter honesty. "The doctor wants me to reduce my work hours, delegate more responsibilities, find ways to manage stress that don't involve ignoring it until my body shuts down. He says I'm 34 years old and showing signs of cardiovascular strain that usually don't appear until people are in their 50s. Emma had been listening to this adult conversation with the focused attention she brought to topics she sensed were important, even when she didn't fully understand all of the implications. Now she climbed carefully onto the edge of Amanda's hospital bed and settled beside her with the confidence of someone who had appointed herself as a source of comfort. "Maybe you could work less and play with us more," Emma suggested, with a kind of practical wisdom that cut through adult complications to reach simple solutions. "Playing is good for stress. Mrs. Patterson says that's why she teaches me card games when I'm worried about things." Amanda smiled for the first time since they'd arrived, pulling Emma closer with the careful movements of someone mindful of hospital tubes and monitoring equipment. "That sounds like excellent medical advice," she said seriously. "Dr. Emma, what other treatments do you recommend?" "More Saturday mornings with pancakes, and maybe you could come to my school play next week. I'm playing a tree, and trees are very calm and peaceful." Michael watched this exchange with a mixture of love for his daughter's innocence and growing concern for Amanda's situation. The woman he'd come to know over Saturday morning coffee was someone who found genuine joy in simple pleasures, but the professional Amanda, who had ended up in the hospital, was someone driven by pressures and expectations that seemed incompatible with the balanced life she claimed to want. "Amanda," Michael said carefully, "what would happen if you actually made those changes the doctor is talking about? Would your company survive if you worked normal hours?" The question seemed to catch Amanda off guard, as if she'd never seriously considered the possibility that Next Tech Solutions might function without her constant oversight and intervention. For someone who had built a successful business empire, the idea that it might be sustainable without her personal sacrifice appeared to be a radical concept. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never tried. I built the company by being the person who worked harder and longer than anyone else, by being available for every decision and every crisis. The idea of stepping back feels like abandoning everything I've created." "But what if stepping back a little bit meant you'd be around longer to enjoy what you've created?" Michael asked. "Emma and I need you to stick around. You've become family to us." Amanda's composure finally cracked completely, and she began crying with the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that suggested years of accumulated grief and exhaustion. Emma responded by wrapping her small arms around Amanda's shoulders and humming the lullaby that Michael used to sing when she had nightmares, offering comfort in the most instinctive way she knew. "I don't know how to be anything other than completely consumed by work. I don't know who I am if I'm not the CEO who never says no to a meeting, who never takes vacations, who makes every sacrifice necessary to keep growing the business. What if I scale back and discover that the company was the only thing that made me worth knowing?" The admission revealed the deep insecurity that had been driving Amanda's unsustainable lifestyle. The fear that her value as a person was entirely tied to her professional achievements. Michael recognized the trap she'd fallen into, having experienced his own version of the same anxiety when his marriage ended and he'd wondered if being a good provider was the only thing that made him worthy of Emma's love. "Amanda, look at me," Michael said firmly. "Emma and I didn't become your friends because you're a successful CEO. We became your friends because you listen to 6-year-old stories about magic rocks like they're the most important thing in the world. Because you get your hands dirty looking for treasures in our backyard. Because you make Emma laugh and you make our Saturday mornings feel special." He leaned forward, making sure she was listening. "The person we care about is the woman who cries during children's movies and learns elaborate tea ceremonies from a first grader. Your company might be impressive, but the person we love has nothing to do with quarterly reports and board meetings." Emma nodded vigorously in agreement. "We like you because you're Amanda, not because you're fancy and important. Being fancy is just extra stuff. Being Amanda is the real thing.
Over the next 3 days, as Amanda remained in the hospital for monitoring and rest, Michael and Emma established a routine of daily visits that transformed the sterile medical environment into something approaching a temporary family gathering place. Emma would arrive each afternoon with new drawings and detailed reports about her school day, while Michael brought updates from the neighborhood and homemade soup that Mrs. Patterson insisted was better than anything the hospital cafeteria could provide. During these quiet hours, Amanda began talking about the changes she wanted to make in her life, not just the medical recommendations about stress management, but deeper shifts in priorities that would allow her to maintain the connections that had become essential to her emotional well-being. She spoke about promoting her capable second-in-command to handle day-to-day operations, about establishing boundaries around work hours, about the possibility of taking actual weekends off to spend with the people who had reminded her what life looked like outside conference rooms and quarterly projections. "I want to be the kind of person who can be present for Emma's school play," Amanda told Michael on her final evening in the hospital. "I want to be someone who doesn't collapse from stress because I've forgotten how to exist as anything other than a business machine." "You already are that person," Michael replied. "You just need to give her permission to exist during the week, not just on Saturday mornings." The crisis had tested their friendship in ways none of them had anticipated, but it had also revealed the depth of connection they'd built over months of simple, consistent care for each other. Amanda's health scare had shown Michael how much their Saturday mornings meant to him and Emma, how much richer their lives had become since they'd invited this unexpected friendship into their modest world. More importantly, it had forced Amanda to confront the unsustainable way she'd been living and the possibility that she could choose differently without losing everything that mattered to her professionally. The woman who had been crying alone in her perfect house 6 months ago now had people who would drop everything to sit beside her hospital bed, and that support had given her the courage to imagine a life where success didn't require the sacrifice of every relationship and simple pleasure that made existence worthwhile. As they prepared to take Amanda Volm from the hospital, Emma made her promise to remember that being happy was more important than being busy, and that friends were supposed to take care of each other, especially when one of them forgot how to take care of themselves. It was advice that Amanda accepted with the seriousness it deserved, understanding that her 6-year-old friend had just offered her the key to a life that balanced achievement with the human connections that made success meaningful. 6 months after Amanda's hospitalization, Michael stood in the wings of Jefferson Middle School's auditorium, adjusting Emma's brown felt costume and trying not to laugh at his daughter's serious concentration as she prepared for her theatrical debut as the wise oak tree in the school's environmental awareness play. Emma had been practicing her single line of dialogue for weeks, delivering, "Even the mightiest oak was once just an acorn that held its ground," with the kind of dramatic gravitas that suggested she understood the profound metaphorical implications of her role in the production. "Is Amanda really coming to watch me?" Emma asked for the 4th time, her excitement barely contained despite her attempts to maintain the dignified demeanor appropriate for someone portraying ancient woodland wisdom. "She promised she'd be here, and Amanda keeps her promises," Michael replied, though privately he felt a flutter of nervous anticipation at the thought of Amanda sitting in the school auditorium alongside Mrs. Patterson and the handful of other adults who'd become their chosen family over the past year. The transformation in Amanda's life since her health crisis had been remarkable to witness, though not always smooth or easy. True to her commitment to change, she promoted David Torres to Chief Operating Officer and established firm boundaries around her work schedule, leaving the office by 6 o'clock each evening and keeping weekends completely free from business obligations. The adjustment had been difficult at first, requiring her to confront years of ingrained habits and the anxiety that came from stepping back from total control of every business decision. But the results spoke for themselves. Next-Tech Solutions continued to thrive under the shared leadership model, while Amanda had rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried under decades of professional ambition. She had started cooking classes on Thursday evenings, joined a weekend hiking group, and even begun volunteering at the children's hospital where she'd spent those 3 transformative days confronting her priorities. More importantly, for Michael and Emma, Amanda had become a constant and reliable presence in their lives, showing up for Emma's soccer games, helping with homework when Michael worked his evening shifts at the diner, and establishing herself as the kind of adult presence that made their small family feel more complete and secure. The auditorium lights dimmed, and Michael made his way to his seat in the 3rd row, where Amanda was already waiting with a bouquet of flowers for Emma and a proud smile that suggested she was as invested in this elementary school production as any parent in the audience. She'd kept her promise to be present for the important moments, and over the months since her hospital stay, those moments had multiplied into a collection of shared experiences that had woven her permanently into the fabric of their daily lives.
Mrs. Patterson sat beside Amanda, the two women having developed their own friendship based on their shared investment in Michael and Emma's well-being and their mutual appreciation for the practical wisdom that came from having lived through various forms of struggle and loss. The elderly widow had become Amanda's mentor in the art of finding joy in simple pleasures, while Amanda had helped Mrs. Patterson navigate the technology needed to video call her grandchildren in distant cities. As the curtain rose and Emma took her place stage left as the wise oak tree, Michael felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected turns his life had taken over the past year. The man who had been struggling to make ends meet while raising his daughter alone had somehow found himself part of a chosen family that included a successful businesswoman who had learned to prioritize relationships over revenue, and a 70-year-old neighbor who had adopted them all as her honorary grandchildren. Emma delivered her line with perfect timing and impressive volume, earning appreciative laughter from the audience, and a whispered, "That's our girl," from Amanda that made Michael's chest swell with pride. The possessive pronoun wasn't lost on him. Amanda had claimed Emma as family with the same fierce protectiveness that Michael brought to his parenting, creating a support system that neither of them had expected, but both had come to depend upon. After the play, as they gathered in the school lobby for the reception of store-bought cookies and fruit punch that constituted the evening's refreshments, Michael watched Amanda crouch down to Emma's level to discuss the finer points of her performance with the kind of engaged attention that suggested she considered first-grade theatrical productions to be serious artistic endeavors worthy of detailed analysis. "You were magnificent," Amanda told Emma solemnly. "I believed completely that you were a wise old tree who had seen generations of forest life. That takes real acting skill." Emma beamed at this professional assessment of her dramatic abilities, then threw her arms around Amanda's neck with the unself-conscious affection that had become routine between them. "Thank you for coming. It made me feel brave to know you were watching." Over Emma's head, Amanda caught Michael's eye with an expression that conveyed everything she'd learned about what really mattered in life. The woman who had once measured success exclusively in terms of quarterly profits and market expansion now understood that being present for a 6-year-old school play was infinitely more valuable than any business meeting she might have missed. As they walked to the parking lot together, Emma chattering about her classmates' performances and her plans for future theatrical endeavors, Michael reflected on how naturally their 3 separate lives had merged into something that felt like destiny rather than coincidence. Amanda's car followed them home as it became routine for Thursday evenings when she would help Emma with her math homework while Michael prepared dinner for all of them. The modest townhouse that had once felt cramped for 2 people now comfortably accommodated their expanded family unit, with Amanda contributing practical improvements like a proper desk for Emma's homework and a coffee maker that actually produced decent results, while never making Michael feel diminished or inadequate about his more limited resources.
"Amanda," Emma said as they settled around the kitchen table with hot chocolate and leftover cookies from the school reception. "Mrs. Patterson says you should move into the house next door to us when old Mr. Henderson moves to Florida. Then we could have family dinners every night." Amanda looked startled by this suggestion, glancing at Michael as if gauging his reaction to Emma's casual assumption that their friendship would naturally evolve into even closer proximity. The idea wasn't unwelcome. Over the months of shared meals and weekend adventures, Michael had grown accustomed to Amanda's presence in ways that made her absence feel like something was missing from their daily routine. "Would you like that?" Amanda asked Michael directly, her voice carrying the kind of vulnerability that suggested the answer mattered more to her than casual curiosity would warrant. "I think Emma's onto something. We've gotten pretty used to having you around. It might be nice to make it official." The conversation that followed was comfortable and practical, covering logistics like lease agreements and the timeline for Mr. Henderson's relocation. But underneath the mundane details was an emotional current that suggested they were really discussing something much more significant than residential arrangements. They were talking about choosing to build their lives around their connection to each other, about making their chosen family structure permanent in ways that would allow it to continue growing and deepening over time. Later that evening, after Emma had gone to bed and Amanda was preparing to return to her own house, she and Michael found themselves lingering on the front steps as they had during so many previous evenings, reluctant to end conversations that had become essential to both of their emotional well-being. "A year ago, I was sitting alone in my expensive house every night, crying because I had everything I thought I wanted and none of what I actually needed," Amanda said quietly, looking across the yard toward the modest townhouses that had become more home to her than her designer showcase ever had.
"A year ago, I was convinced that Emma and I would always be struggling just to get by, that friendship and community were luxuries we couldn't afford," Michael replied. "It's amazing how wrong we can be about what's possible." Amanda turned to study his face in the porch light, her expression serious with the weight of what she wanted to say. "Michael, I need you to know that you and Emma didn't just save me from loneliness. You saved me from a life that was slowly killing me. You gave me back the parts of myself that I'd forgotten existed." "You did the same for us," Michael said simply. "You showed Emma that dreams can come true when good people care about each other. You showed me that there are still people in the world who choose kindness over convenience." The conversation might have continued deeper into territory that would require careful navigation of changing feelings and evolving relationships, but Emma's voice calling from her bedroom window interrupted the moment with perfect timing. "Amanda, don't forget that tomorrow is Pancake Saturday, and I want to show you my new magic rock that changes colors in different light." They both laughed at Emma's priorities, but the interruption felt appropriate rather than frustrating. Their relationship had been built on the foundation of caring for Emma together, and whatever it evolved into would need to honor that original commitment to putting her well-being at the center of their decisions. As Amanda drove home to her contemporary house that increasingly felt like a way station between her old life and whatever came next, Michael stood on his front porch and marveled at the unexpected grace that had transformed their small world. A year ago, he had been a single father barely keeping his head above water, convinced that struggle was his permanent condition and that hoping for better was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now, he was part of a chosen family that included a successful businesswoman who had learned to value connection over achievement, a wise elderly neighbor who had appointed herself as their honorary grandmother, and a 6-year-old daughter whose innocent belief in the power of kindness to change the world had proven to be not just optimism, but prophecy. The story that had begun with Emma's simple observation that their neighbor was crying had evolved into something none of them could have imagined, a demonstration that love could indeed transcend all the surface differences that seemed so important until they simply stopped mattering in the face of genuine human connection. Tomorrow would bring another Saturday morning of pancakes and coffee, of Emma's endless stories about magic rocks and school adventures,
of Amanda's laughter filling their kitchen with the sound of someone who had remembered how to be happy. But tonight, Michael was content to stand on his front porch and feel grateful for the mysterious ways that lives intersected and transformed each other through the simple willingness to notice when someone needed help and the courage to offer it without expecting anything in return. Sometimes salvation came in grand gestures and dramatic interventions, but more often it arrived quietly through the accumulation of small kindnesses, shared meals, and the decision to keep showing up for each other even when the world suggested that people from different circumstances had nothing meaningful to offer one another. Emma had been right all along. Everyone needed friends when they were sad, and the best friendships were the ones built not on similarity of circumstances, but on recognition of shared humanity and the commitment to care for each other through whatever challenges life might bring. In the end, that was really all any family needed to thrive. The willingness to notice, the courage to reach out, and the persistence to keep choosing love over fear in all the small daily moments that actually determined how lives unfolded. The porch light glowed warmly as Michael finally headed inside to his own bed, already looking forward to tomorrow morning when their chosen family would gather again around the kitchen table and Emma would share her latest discoveries about magic rocks while Amanda listened with the kind of attention that proved love didn't require grand declarations but could be expressed perfectly through the simple act of taking a child's wonder seriously. Their story would continue evolving, but the foundation had been established. Three people who had chosen to care for each other had created something more valuable than individual success or security could ever provide. They had created a family built on love rather than obligation, connection rather than circumstance, and the radical belief that everyone deserved to be seen, valued, and supported by people who showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to be there. That was the real magic Emma had been searching for all along, and it had been waiting for them next door, crying at a window, just hoping someone would notice and care enough to reach out across all the barriers that kept people apart until someone decided those barriers didn't matter as much as human connection. In the quiet suburban night, that seemed like exactly the kind of miracle worth believing in. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.